What's going on, everybody? My name is Ben, and welcome back to the bench for a brand new episode here on Sci-Fi Wednesdays. We are back on the Podracer, and today, guys, this is going to be the last episode for this series. So let's go ahead and jump in. We have a lot to do. So first off, last episode went ahead and overcoated the pod with a nice gloss black finish, then pre-shaded with a bit of all-clad chrome, and then overcoated it with duraluminum, also by all-clad. We have to come in and adjust these little trenches and these guides for the tether, but otherwise we are ready for gloss coat and eventually decals. So we'll get on that today. We also have to come back in and gloss coat the front little foils. These have to be decaled as well. They have some marking on the very ends. And of course, we have to come in and gloss coat our engines because these have to have a little bit more weathering done to them, like a sludge wash or something, to make that last bit of detail really pop out at you. And then we'll just go ahead and get them installed down to the base. Now, the base itself, as you can see, is pretty much unfinished. We've got wooden frame, pink foam. We've got some plaster rocks, some real rocks as well. So we have to come in and do a lot of work on this, plus trim down the rocks to make sure they fit within the wooden frame. So this is going to take some primer, it's going to take some pre-shade, some post-shade, all dirt and different mixtures of tile grout and ballast to get this thing looking like a rocky sandy base. And then we have to go ahead and put everything onto the base, and we can call this one quits. Now first off, I'm going to go ahead and jump into our first time lapse, and I want to work on getting everything nicely gloss coated, and I want to go ahead and get the base primed. That's going to be our first main thing. Let's jump on in there, guys. Let's start this process. Let's get our Podracer all finished up. Alright guys, so we are back and we have gone ahead and overcoated everything with a nice coat of Future. So we're going to go ahead and move on to decals. And as you saw, we were able to go ahead and start laying down a nice primer coat on the base. Plus we added in our ballast, our tile grout, and then we just started coming in and doing a little bit of work here and there and getting that thing ready for paint. So I think we're coming along. We're getting there. Moving on to the decals, however, this is going to be an interesting procedure because these decals, they come off the backing super quick, but they don't really seem to want to conform to surface details. And unfortunately, the Podracer does have a couple of areas that have a little bit of surface detail, so we're going to have to apply a lot of microsol and microset to make sure that these go ahead and conform to the different bumps and curves of the pod. On top of that, we need to go ahead and make sure that what we do put on here actually lines up, because we have some blue bands that go around the back of the pod, and I have a feeling that none of those are going to want to line up perfectly. They're going to have a little bit of issue, probably be slightly off here and there. Want to really make sure that those line up, and then we can go ahead and overcoat with a little bit of microsol, and I'm hoping that goes ahead and gets them nicely conformed down to the different curves of the rear portion here on the pod. So let's go ahead and jump back into our time lapse. Let's get on those decals. Let's get this thing all nicely decaled up. All right, everybody, so we are back, and the decals went on decently, not perfect, but they'll work. They did not fit as well, kind of like I feared, but you know what? It looks good, so I'm happy with it. The 3-foot rule definitely comes into play here. So now we're going to turn our attention over to the base, and this is going to be a little bit more complicated because this is going to require a lot of painting. So we're going to cut off these little excess rocks, and we're going to come in with different colors. We're going to start by overcoating everything with a little bit of our pre-shade, like a reddish brown. Then we're going to come back over it with different desert colors like desert sand, desert yellow, buff, deck tan, whatever we've got. We're going to make this look as deserty as possible. So let's go ahead and jump in there. We're going to try it out. Plus I want to go ahead and fill up some of the cracks between the wooden frame and the foam base, just to make sure that everything is nicely melded in there. So let's go ahead and get into it, guys. We still have a lot left to do, but we're getting there. Let's go ahead and paint up a rocky desert base. All right, everybody, so we are back, and as you can see, we've done quite a bit of work here on the base. We've got different colors, we've got different washes. We used a lot of rust washes to make sure that this tints it a little bit pre-shaded, post-shaded. We still have to paint the frame, but everything on the inside is more or less pre-shaded, post-shaded, colored. I've dry brushed down with a little bit of buff, a little bit of deck tan, and I think it looks pretty good. For the dirt mixture, I used tile grout. I used some ballast from Woodland Scenics, and I went ahead and just applied a little bit of isopropyl alcohol to break up the surface tension, and then a little bit of watered down PVA glue, and that seems to have done the trick. I left that sitting for a while, and as you can see here, we've got everything painted now from pre-shade all the way up to our flat coat. So we are good. You also might have noticed that we went ahead and we overcoated the engines with our gloss coat, and now we've come in there with a little bit of weathering as well. We used a nice clay-based wash from UMP, went over everything, wiped it down. It did actually bring out a lot of the little hidden details, so I'm pretty happy with it. So now we're going to go ahead and start working on the engines, getting them mounted down to the base, and that's going to be tricky. We have to make sure that the spacing between the engines and the pod stays the same length as we have for our tethers, and that's going to be a little bit of a difficult challenge. I've also went ahead and cut down some of our hollow tubing to act as supports. We're going to start feeding through the wires, and we've already drilled a hole in one end of it, and that's going to be where the wires come out of, down our tube, through the base, and into the undersurface, where then we'll hook them up with the battery pack and the switches. So we actually should be pretty decent there. As you can see, though, we'll have 3 wires coming out of each of these holes. And this is why I left the front of the engine off, so I could get my tweezers in there and kind of fish those wires down through the opening. So that's why I left that front end off, and I think think it's actually paid off quite nicely. We also have to go ahead and run our wire for that front coupler that actually is going to be those LEDs, and that's going to be also a little tricky because the spacing I've got here for that coupler is actually shorter than the LED. I probably could have gone with even a shorter LED setup, but you know what? It is what it is. I'm going to pull it through, and then I'm going to go ahead and paint the inside with some light blocking acrylic paint, and that should go ahead and take care of any potential for light leaks. So I think we'll be okay. For our tubing, we're using some plain old aluminum tubing. This is nothing fancy. Sometimes I use brass, but I didn't have any left in stock, so I went ahead and I used this instead. And this actually bends a little bit easier, so I'm hoping that it actually helps us in positioning these engines exactly as we want them. And again, I want them a little bit canted to the right, just as if he's banking, to give the impression that he's turning the Podracer. I also don't want the engines to be perfectly parallel. I want one end to be slightly up, the other one to be slightly down, because I want this to give the impression as it's in action. Putting on the power, he's turning the Podracer, he's banking it. I have no idea how it's going to go though, but that's what we're going to be trying to do. Now that I have the tubing all nicely set up, we're going to go ahead and feed down the tubing and get everything squared away. I think that's one of the challenges here on this build is to try to get these engines positioned in such a way where they look like they're in action and everything still flows and fits well with the base. I've held up the tethers, I've held up the pod, and this is about where I want the engines to start. Now the nice thing about using foam is that you can go ahead and take your tubing and just give it a little turn and it will already score, and then you can actually put a little bit of pressure while turning and you can bore down through the entire foam base, rocks and all. Now you couldn't do this if it was a plaster base. This is why I went with foam. We do have some plaster rocks on here, but again, the areas where I wanted the pod and the engines, they're all foam. That's going to be super, super helpful. I pushed that pipe all the way down through the rocks and through the foam base, and I think we are ready to go ahead and clean it out a little bit, and then we can put it into the engine. Now, word to the wise, if you're going to go ahead and do something like this on a model of yours, and you want to go ahead and have a certain diameter of pipe, start off with a smaller drill bit. Drill a pilot hole, and then once you are satisfied with that, then move up to the bigger drill size. I think that's actually really important because it keeps the drill bit exactly where you want it. Might be a good idea to start off with a pilot hole first so that you can get in there and be a bit more precise with your placements so that you can get that pipe exactly where you need it, pull your wires through, and you're good to go. This one will be a little bit longer as well because it's got to go down through 2 rocks plus the base. Then I can go ahead and I can fish these wires individually through this opening. Again, this is why I left the front of the engine completely open so I can get in there with tweezers, fish the wires where they needed to go. Once these are through, I've got another length of pipe set up ready to go. So all I need to do is pull these wires down through the pipe. I can figure out exactly where I want the engine. And then again, just like I did with the other one, I can give a little bit of a twist, it'll score it, then I can just push a piece of pipe right down through the rocks, and then we can fish our wires back down through. And again, after a little bit of measurement, I think I want it right about here. So we have a spare piece of pipe. We're going to go ahead and start that scoring process. Slow, steady pressure, pushing down through these rocks while turning this pipe. It's going to cut a nice little opening. And as you can see, it pokes right down through the bottom of it. And once this is through, I'll be able to go ahead and cut the pipe down to size, and then we can go ahead and glue it down. And I'm going to glue it into the base with just some basic hot glue. And then once that is set up, I've got the wires pulled down through, and we can go ahead and give that little twist to the LED coupler right there in the middle of the engines. Seal it up, and we can move on. And before I forget, guys, I did want to come in here with a little bit of Tamiya flat blue and just go along the very top of each of these decals, just to make sure that we don't have any silver showing through. Just a little bit of overpaint. Now, since I've got the engines already mounted in, I've got our coupler between engines nicely twisted. It looks awesome. We're going to go ahead and glue in the fronts of the engines because next we got to glue on the foils. I also want to go ahead and use some of this clear pink paint that I've got from Mr. Color. And we're going to go over the LEDs just to give it a little bit of a pinkish hue when you're not looking at the lit LED. As you can see, though, we flip it on. It's got a really, really nice color. I love it. It's super dynamic, and I think it's going to be a great addition to the model. Now, I did mention the frame itself, and I've got some nice vintage cherry stain, and we're going to go ahead and apply a couple of layers here on the outside wooden frame. This wood is, of course, unsealed, so it's going to soak up that color really, really well. Just going to do a couple of coats here to give it a little bit of a different color than the rocky, sandy base. I want it to kind of stand out a bit. I could have just painted it black, but I felt like going with a warmer color would be a little bit better to the eye. Otherwise, it's a bit too stark. So let's jump back into the time lapse, guys. We have a little bit more to do. We have to go ahead and do the final assembly, get everything soldered up, add in those front details for the foils, get the tethers installed. And that's going to be a bit tricky, and then get everything soldered up. So let's get back in there, guys. Let's finish off our Podracer. We'll be back and I'll show you guys what we come up with. Let's do it. everybody, we are back and we have finished off our Podracer. Everything is attached, everything is glued down, everything is weathered, everything is sealed, and this turned out far better than I could have ever hoped. It is a really awesome kit. I did a lot of fun work on the base, added in those LEDs, and I am super happy with how it's turned out. Let's go ahead and grab the kit. And here it is, the Anakin Podracer kit from AMT Round 2 with Rocky base, custom wooden frame. Plus, we've got a nice little bit of LEDs. I had an absolute blast with this model, and I think it actually is super cool. We actually have two switches. I made an executive decision. I have one switch that powers on the cockpit LEDs, as you can see here. Cockpit lights will function with those 3 gauges, which actually light up the decals on top of those, so it looks pretty good. And then the front of that does light up the tether as well as the 2 engine LEDs. That's one of my favorite parts of this entire build. Undersurface, we went ahead and overcoated the pink foam with a black acrylic just to protect it. We've got all of our wires nicely tacked into place and our battery packs glued down to the foam. Anakin's pod is controlled by a watch coin cell battery, 3 volt. And the front engines are controlled by 2 AA batteries in a larger battery pack. So I think ultimately this was a lot of fun. Now the wooden frame itself was a very simple matter of just staining it. I used this vintage classic cherry stain. It actually worked out really, really well. I love it. I didn't want to do it glossy. I wanted it a bit more on the muted, flatter side, so that turned out great. These tethers, though, I gotta tell you, these were not fun to work with. I don't like the hard plastic tethers. I wish they were something a bit more flexible. I had to come back in and adjust each part with my reheat gun, and that worked out perfectly fine. It was nice, controlled blast of hot air, which would get it a little bit softer, and I could manipulate it to fit in where it needed to go. Still not perfect, but it's better than having these stiff plastic rods. Now, for the front of the pod engine, as you can see, I tried to adjust those foils to act a little bit more like they were in motion. All those foils, they are actually at different positions. Some are open, some are slightly closed. I wanted that to look like it was moving and it was kind of flexing and kind of bobbing up and down, so I didn't want them exactly uniform. I think a little bit of asymmetry in this case is a good thing. The pod itself is also not centered within the 2 engines. As you can see, it's slightly canted over to the one side, because my thinking would be that the engines would be moving left and right, the pod's moving left and right, the different foils are opening and closing to adjust for speed, direction, the whole 9 yards. So I wanted to give it a little bit more action and have it look kind of cool. Giving you a real quick zoom in here, we can check out some of the detail. Here we go with the pod itself. We've got those LEDs nicely lit up. I did not like the supplied windscreen. I thought that was not the greatest job ever, but we made it work. Not too bad. We've got the pod weathered down with a little bit of UMP clay-based wash. We've got the tethers installed, and like I said, they were a little bit of some trouble getting those where we needed them to go, but we got them in there. As I mentioned as well, the front of the engines are slightly weathered. We've got the coupler that goes across between the engines as an LED. I've got the inside all nicely light blocked, so you don't have any light leaks, which is also very, very cool. And again, I wanted a little bit of motion and action, so foils are open and closed at different rates, and I think it looks pretty neat. The tether coming off this upper engine was a little trickier to do. Got it in position where I'm happy with it, and as you can see, the engine's lit up, has a nice glow about it. That coupled with the rock base with the wooden frame, I am super happy with how this has turned out. This was a really fun project. But anyway, guys, after 7 weeks here on the bench, we are finished up with our Anakin Podracer, and I gotta tell you, this has been one of my most ambitious builds, but also it's been some of the most fun I've had yet. So I gotta say thank you so much to all of you for watching, and thank you again to my colleague and coworker that actually commissioned this from me. I couldn't be happy with how this turned out. Hopefully they will enjoy it as much as I enjoyed working on it. A couple of different areas here and there could use some improvement though. I would actually go ahead and take a look at Anakin, try to get a different print. I'd switch these out to maybe a rubber tubing of the same diameter, and then that windscreen, not the best. However, if you can look past those things, you can make an awesome looking Podracer. So until our next episode, guys, thank you so much for joining us. You guys know the drill. Go out there, get yourself some bench time, have some fun, build something cool, and we'll see you back here next week for a brand new project coming up here on Sci-Fi Wednesdays. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care of yourselves, and may the Force be with you.